Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You are about to listen to an episode of the Audio Signals podcast with Marco Ciappelli. In this new season, Audio Signals is repositioning its antennas, focusing not just on the stories, but on the storytellers. In our modern hybrid analog-digital society, the art of storytelling has never been more vital or displayed such a diverse array of forms. Recognizing this, our conversations will spotlight the narrators, providing a unique exploration into the minds behind the narratives. From authors to podcasters, visual artists to songwriters, and everything in between, we will engage with all who contribute to this extraordinary tapestry of human experience. We are all made of stories, after all.
All right, everybody, this is Audio Signal podcast. I have to say that I'm not even going to make an introduction today. This is Bill. He's been on this show with me, not on this show, on Redefining Society. We talked about something that still storytelling, but it was about a political, technological story about the Camp David Pact. Today, we are an Audio Signal podcast, and we were already chatting. I say, hey, hold on a second. Let's just hit record and let's keep doing it. This is about him as a person of travel for work, as a journalist all over the world that has a passion for food and good wine. He wrote some books about that. So I said, those are great stories, aren't those, Bill?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, Marco. And I guess my journey begins when I was in college. I was lucky enough to have as a professor John Hersey, who wrote the famous book Hiroshima, appeared in the New Yorker, first man to really discover the true devastation that the atomic bomb had brought, and to describe it in a narrative nonfiction using fictional techniques, but it was all true stories. And we had a very small seminar with him when I was at Yale, and I went off really inspired that the stories of people could really make a difference if they were told from the bottom up. And I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to go to Europe after I graduated. And I said, I'll be a foreign correspondent. And I remember walking around the streets of Paris, going into every American journalist's office and saying, hey, do you have a free desk? I'll do some free research for you. And one journalist said yes. And soon enough, I was writing away. I became a staff correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and spent 10 really happy years with them. And I was doing serious politics mostly, but I always loved the sort of underlying stories of real people on the ground that John Hersey had taught me about, I think. And I went from 1981 to 85, so you can know how old I am, but I went and covered mostly Western Europe, France, and from 85 to 90, I was lucky enough to cover Central Europe, the communist Europe, behind the Iron Curtain. And I spent
And I know you wrote a book about that too, right?
Yeah, that was my first book, and it was really I was lucky because no one thought there was a story there. It was I would go to Poland, and there were 4 or 5 of us as American journalists, maybe a couple more, but not many in the entire region, because it was sort of frozen, people thought. But I saw these great stories about how environmental activists were getting signing petitions, how religious movements were peppering up, flourishing, and how young people were really changing and calling for freedom. So when everyone thinks that Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union brought all the change, I was really convinced a lot of it was forced from the bottom up, and he just opened the door and let them go through. That was my first book. I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, telling stories of upward of individuals who are making a difference from the bottom up. I mean, it was about the book was about environmental activists starting a movement to clean up water that turned political, and who could be against clean
how
water?
things started. That was their
and it was
point.
about religious activists signing a petition for religious freedom. I remember going to a little Czech village and meeting the author of the petition, who had been thrown into a psychiatric hospital and so forth, and yet had brought real change and really questioned the government all before the revolutions. And I always wondered whether I would have had the same courage to stand up for values and freedom. And it was really inspiring to me, to the people I met. I was lucky enough to meet, Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa, and all the others, and then say, a few months later, they became president, prime minister, and so forth. So it was really a privileged time. And the first book is called Lighting the Night. It was written very fast after the revolutions. I think it was a great book. In my opinion, but it was really a firsthand account right then and there. I probably should update it 20 years later when the story is both positive.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I was in Europe at the time, in my 20s, so I remember the excitement of that. And and I had the opportunity actually to visit Prague with a soccer team at the time when I was 17, when the wall was still up. So we had some special permits to go there, and I mean, it was beautiful city, beautiful place, and actually in Budapest as well.
Yeah,
a lot of culture. And talking about that, what do you do when you go visit the first time a new place, especially in Europe, where I always say that, and I don't know about you, I mean, you also have the both side of experience. Like, you're in America more often, unless you really go to the extreme part of the country, and you find different kind of traditional food, but you can always find that common, denominator food. Maybe it's the fast food, maybe it's the hamburger, I don't know. But when you go in Europe and you cross the border, especially 20, 30 years ago, it was a different world. I mean, different food, 100%. Different experience. Like, I don't even know what this is.
It's not. I have to admit that going to Central Europe, communist Central Europe in the 1980s, was not what developed my culinary tastes. Well,
you were in Paris, but I guess what I'm saying is, and we dive more into that, is that even if you may not like it or may not be the best, French cuisine or Italian cuisine, but you still get a flavor, pun intended, of their culture, the way of living. I mean, it reflects who they are, their economy, and in that case, unfortunately, their politics too.
You're totally right. I mean, I would go to Poland and say, this is my grandmother's cooking, because it so much resembled. There were no Jews left there, but there was a lot of Ashkenazi Jewish style cooking with the duck and cherries, the stuff that my grandmom used to make, the gefilte fish and so forth. So yeah, I always did see food and wine as a sort of window onto society in an exciting way. I mean, even I remember going to the Basque country, and when they were doing I was doing a story on the politics of nationalism in the Basque country, but I took time out to do a story on the 3-star Michelin restaurant there, because he really, the Basques are incredibly proud of their cooking, and it's part of their cultural identity, like you say. But I guess what really turned me to food and wine was, after I'd done the positive revolutions and covered the positive revolutions in Central Europe, the story moved to the Yugoslavia, and I covered the beginning of that tragedy, the war. Actually, my successor at the Christian Science Monitor won Pulitzer Prize for uncovering the massacre at Srebrenica. Oh. I had always thought that in northern, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, it was positive patriotism and desire for freedom. It was all nonviolent. In the Balkans, it was violent and negative nationalism. I stayed and did it, but I wanted to do something different. That wasn't my war correspondency, wasn't really what I was just started a family, and I felt like, no, this isn't really how I want to spend the next 5 years of my life in the Balkans. I spent a lot of time there, did it. And I looked for another project, and I found the project in, of all places, I wrote a small article for The Economist about a chef in France who had 2 Michelin stars and wanted to get his 3rd. And I sold the book project after the article came out, and moved to Burgundy with my young family, young son who lives in Los Angeles now. But so we moved to Burgundy with a baby, and basically lived in a village for a year. And I tried to tell, it was my second book. It was called Burgundy Stars, and it was a book that tried to tell the story of Michelin Guide, of course, and a chef's quest, but really the life behind a famous restaurant. What do they do from top to bottom? So there's the story of the American galley slave, stagiaire, you call them galley slave here, but who comes to France to try to work in this restaurant and gets fired. And then there's the story of the sommelier who goes out and gets the wines, and the wife's role, how women have a tough time in a restaurant, haute cuisine in general, and how, you're basically a military operation in this restaurant. So I thought it was the first sort of realistic book about haute cuisine. Not everything wasn't pretty and wonderful, but it was rough and tough. And it was a book that really tried to talk about how France was modernizing, but keeping some traditions. It was about the history of cooking. There was the communist restaurant in the village, which dealt with the workers. And then I was portraying the restaurant that was favored by the right wing, so it was political. It was about the rise of the automobile, because there was the Michelin Guide, the Michelin tires, and the whole history of these great restaurants that were basically put on the road from Paris to Nice. As people went on vacation, they would stop and
I want to open a parenthesis here, because a lot of people use Michelin stars. They all know that means excellent level of cuisine, but not only cuisine, but service and all of that. Mm-hmm. But very little, I think, they think about Michelin as the tires and how the beginning of the actual book started. So maybe if you want to throw a little bit of background on that would be.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the Michelin Guide was created at the same time as the rise of the automobile, and it was created to encourage people to use their automobile and go get a great meal. Yep. And the restaurant that I portrayed was in Burgundy, was one of the first stop out of Paris, where you would stop for the night, have a great meal, and move on. So it was a historic restaurant from the 1930s.
Was it the first TripAdvisor? What do you think?
Well, we have no. The Michelin Guide still has, the anonymous. There was the mystery around it.
But I mean, it's kind of like, okay, I need a book. I don't know where I'm going. Who's the reviewer? In this case, it's not the internet, but it was an actual guide and book.
Yeah, I mean, the book tried. I mean, later when Anthony Bourdain wrote, his epic stories about restaurant life. My book tried to do the same to a large extent, to be very realistic about the stress and the chef himself. It was a very sad story. He was a wonderful man named Bernard Loiseau. He was a manic depressive. It was pretty clear, and I tell about that in the book. But at that time, that type of up and down was something that you didn't deal with very well in France. It wasn't really acknowledged as a real thing. And then 10 years after I finished the book, he committed suicide, which was really a real tragedy. But he was a wonderful man who was passionate about what he was doing and fun to be with, and a bon vivant, but also a performer, a real star. It was the up and down of the time I was looking at this. his food was changing in France. It was moving away from heavy sauces and being much more minimalistic. Nouvelle cuisine was coming in, and he was taking it a next step forward. His dishes were very pure. He would take out all the extraneous stuff. 2 to 3 elements was enough for him, and he had a great eye for turning traditional dishes into something more modern and acceptable to our.
So was this something that was reflecting on your opinion? I mean, you obviously tell the story of one restaurateur, one restaurant. Was it a good example of what was happening all over?
Well,
France,
at the time it was. It is. I mean, I was telling the story of Nouvelle Cuisine and the aftermath, and I interviewed Paul Bocuse and all the other. I remember going to Trois Gros because Bernard had started his career at Trois Gros, who was the forerunner of great Nouvelle Cuisine, which was really to bring the chef out of the background and promote the chef as a superstar. So you had these working class guys who all of a sudden it was no longer the owner of the restaurant, it was the chef who was the superstar. That was new. And what happened after I left was the cooking moved on. I remember I did cooking shows for PBS with a partner in New York, and we went to Spain and they started using, it was El Bulli. We were one of the first to do a TV show and write about El Bulli, which is this crazy restaurant in Catalonia, just south of the French border. They were using foams and gels and explosions, and it was molecular cuisine. Mm-hmm. And Bernard looked at this and he thought it was just weird, and he couldn't deal with it.
And I think you used a nice word there, weird. He probably said something different.
Yeah, he thought it was just not like, he would prefer a roast chicken that was well done to sort of gel.
Being Italian, I can think about a few people that that have restaurant and will think that's not. But I've seen special on that. It's interesting. It's experimenting, because that's what cooking
really
is too.
Over time, and it used to be that Spanish cuisine was just sort of emulating French and copying it. I remember the 3-star Michelin restaurant in Basque Country. He had trained classic French cooking, but I think food is also interesting because it follows money, and it says a lot about the economy of a country. And as Spain got rich, all of a sudden they had a market for new things. They always had great products, great hams, great olives, great vegetables, great fish. I mean, it's amazing produce and bounty of the land, but now they had sort of complete freedom to invent and go upscale in a really determined way. And the French didn't like it. I remember when we did the show where we invited the El Bulli chef Ferran Adria to Paris for the first time, and he was cooking with Michel Guérard. I think Bocuse was there, but Bernard. I think Bernard was there too. So a lot of them. And, this Spanish interloper came in and sort of drove all the French crazy, I think, basically. And then they started copying him. So it moves in both directions, I think.
So I think you said something interesting. At least it grabbed my attention, because I like to watch Bourdain, all the show. Because, I mean, he was really great in telling you. He was talking about food, but he was telling about people living in these places. I mean, episode like in Singapore or in Thailand or other places. It wasn't just about the food. It was chatting with people. What are the problem? What are the things that they do? I mean, the culture, what they're trying to achieve. But you said something about the coming out from the kitchen to the front stage. And I like that, and it kind of, there is a story there, in my opinion. When you look at TV show now, either it's a pizzaiolo in Naples, or is somebody that makes tapas, right? Tapas in Catalonia or whatever it is. They are representing the restaurant. You don't even know who owns the restaurant, and I want you to elaborate more on that. I mean, what does it mean? Did it become entertainment on top of good food? What?
Well, it was a change in role, right? I mean, the chef became the identity of the restaurant. And often in the case that I was, Bernard Boiseau, he owned the restaurant. He had taken that alone. And part of the book recounts how he goes public with his company and starts building franchise restaurants in Paris and so forth, and leveraging his name by producing frozen food with the largest frozen food producer.
Do I see a Disney movie here?
Excuse me?
Do I see a Disney movie here?
Well, there was a movie that seemed to take a lot of. Actually, there were two movies made off of this book, but one was a French movie called American Chef with Eddie Michel, and I believe it followed the story of the young American intern, galley slave, stagiaire, and if you want to use the French, going to a fancy French restaurant and working there and falling in love. That part didn't happen in my book, but in the movie it does. And there was another, Ratatouille, which people have heard more. It's I was listening when I was in the movie theater and watching that. I said, sounds familiar.
Yeah, they're all taking over and making frozen food, definitely.
Yeah. No, I mean, there was definitely there were a lot of themes that came out in Hollywood or in movies afterwards about this. So
that's yeah. So it does represent all these cultural changes and money. That at the end it goes with that.
I mean, what's interesting in food now in Europe, is that food definitely follows money, but there used to be a great division, I think, between Protestant Northern Europe and Catholic Southern Europe. With you ate well. I mean, I'm living in Belgium now, so in Belgium, Catholic country, you eat really well. French finesse with German-sized portions, but you cross the border to Protestant Netherlands, and it was pretty food as fuel. And very uninteresting, to say the least, in my opinion. And further north, even less interesting. But all of a sudden, after Spain went, molecular cuisine, New Nordic came in, and Noma in Copenhagen, and the idea of Nordic berries and not scavenging, but going into the forest and getting your mushrooms and your herbs and so forth. Much of the most innovative cooking goes to the Nordic region. So the religious barriers to food following money have broken down in the last 20 years, and I think that's part of the story in America. We were growing up. I was pretty. I remember going back to America and seeing 1990 to write my first book on communism, and remembering in Boston, I was at Harvard, that the supermarkets only had apples at that point. I thought, and after coming from a decade in France, it was pretty bare stuff in America. America's changed a lot too.
So let's explain this, because there is this social cultural correlation and with the religions and the food, and again, everything is always connected. So let's put it that way. But so this division and different leaning one side or another of really good food versus food is mostly for sustain yourself. It's coming from religious background. I never actually thought it like that. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think definitely there is that type of attitude towards food that is in Protestant countries, that it is fuel, it's sustenance. And Catholic Europe, being around the table, enjoying, even being gluttonous is seen as a virtue in some ways. I think. Right. Or at least acceptable.
And talking about religion, and it makes me think about wine. Of course, it's a different kind of wine, the wine you get into church. But I know that you were in Burgundy, and for people familiar, I mean, one of the best wine in the world come from there. I'm from Tuscany, so we kind of touched on this last time. It's bad, maybe taste, but I got to be honest. I'm not a connoisseur of wine. I'm not a sommelier or anything, and I know good wine when I try it. But I know you actually wrote about that too. But you wrote it with a kind of the economical, political perspective.
Exactly. I mean, at that, so the book on Burgundy, one chapter is about going with the sommelier. I used to leave at 9 a.m, come back at 9 p.m, my lips all red and everything, but about how they stocked the cellar. And it was also, there was a chapter about the traditions of Burgundy wine growing, which are very sort of, it's small family-owned domains and so forth, and how they were reaching now a global market and so forth. And I kept on writing about wine. Wrote for the Wine Spectator, but also I wrote a cover story for Business Week. I worked as a staff reporter at Business Week during the end of the 1990s, and Bordeaux seemed to be the country, the region that really represented wine and so forth. So I spent a year in Bordeaux, following 4 stories about following a year of harvesting and vinifying, and then so you have the cycle of the year, but you have also 4 stories about the different, let's say, pictures of Bordeaux. One was the book is called Noble Rot, and one was about an aristocratic family that was selling out its esteemed estate, where they made noble rot wines, Sauterne, the sweet wines, and the family fight over whether they should sell out or not sell out. Another was about investment bank coming in and buying a big estate and overturning it on the left bank, and another was about the guys producing wines in garages on the right bank that were rivaling the prices of the most expensive wines. And the last one was about a cooperative making everyday wines. And
again, what year was this?
I was there 2001. I remember because it was the attacks on the World Trade Center happened during the middle of the harvest.
So it was kind of like the beginning of that transition where, I mean, I'm not saying the wine always had a pretty high status, not always, but lately. But at a certain point, it became more again of a big investment, where corporations started to get involved.
Yeah.
The land, I mean, even here in California, for example, lately they've been transforming a lot of the landscape. And I think they embraced a lot the technology too.
Yes. So, I mean,
traditional, but technology is heavy there. It's a delicate product to do.
Yes, but there was, so part of the book was also about fast France, modern France, because in this most traditional wine growing regions, you had some of the most innovative enologists, the guys who were consulting and making wine. And I remember following Michel Rolland, who is a famous flying winemaker, on a full day as he went and tasted in his
flying.
Well, because he was making wine in Chile, in Argentina, in South Africa, and California.
Oh, wow.
And the criticism was that his wines tasted all the same. For me, they all tasted great because they were all fresh, fruity, and juicy. And he was a superstar, reinventing sort of how you mixed wines, but also they would make sure the harvests were, they would do green harvesting, reducing the yields, because if you produce less grapes on the same vineyards, you produce a more concentrated juice. And he would use carbon, they would sort of not freeze, but make it stop fermentation so that they would keep it fresh, and none of the sort of bitterness that you can get into or weediness that can get into sort of poor wines. But he was also very criticized by traditionalists as not allowing the sound and the taste of the terroir of the land come through, because he masked it in these overripe grapes. And there was also an American angle to all of this story, which was, there was the American critic Robert Parker, who invented this 100-point system, which allowed someone who didn't have a 300-year-old chateau, some of the guys making wine in their garage, if they made really great wine and Robert Parker gave you a grade over 90 points, you could sell it at very high price in America. And that was transforming the economics of Bordeaux. Guys didn't need to have the ranking from 1855 to get high prices for their wines, and that was part of my
So
story.
how does this innovation of the 100-point ranking came to be?
So, traditionally there was a classification in Bordeaux, and it was set in stone in 1855. You were a first growth, second growth, fourth growth, and it couldn't really be changed.
No, not opening for new generation.
Right. So that was noble rot, right? So you got these guys from 1855 who were making good or bad wines, often indifferent, but they had the Premier Grand Cru, and they could sell it for whatever they wanted. And the American came in, and he lives in north of Baltimore, and not in a wine growing region. He just would taste what he tasted and like what he liked, and he invented the 100-point system based on how we grade our, in classroom, right, up to 100 points. And the saying soon became that, if you get more than 90 points, you can't find it because it's sold out. If you get less than 90 points, you can't sell it. And that was really revolutionizing French wines, because he became the arbiter in many ways. There were others who came in and do something similar, but the Wine Spectator, James.
Sounds like a little bit more meritocratic and using standard that you can apply. I guess it involved the taste, it involves the way it's made, it involves a lot of different parameters, I'm assuming, instead of here's my brand, here's my name, I've done it for a long time. But that doesn't mean it's good. Not every year is the same year on the wine year.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally true. He's very controversial in the sense half of the traditionalists in France say he's ruining French wine, and he's a horror. And half say, God, I'm getting rich because of this guy. I mean, you would walk in Côte d'Or, also outside of Bordeaux. He basically took Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which was considered a sort of okay but nothing special wine, and brought it up into the stratosphere. So you go in and there's streets named after him, because he really made entire regions and villages. And the trick of French wines are difficult because you have 100 or maybe 1,000 lots of wines being made in a village like Saint-Emilion. And some are just fantastic, world-beating, and many are just horrible. And the label doesn't tell you anything. It just says Saint-Emilion, and you're lost. I mean, it's not like Champagne, where there are big brands that are sort of assuring the regular quality of something. It doesn't happen in France. You go from the simple to the sublime in the same next door neighbors can be making completely different wines. There's relatively small properties by global standards. So, he walked in and shook that world up, and that's what I was writing about, which was it really is a little bit our French-American relationship, love and hate, right? I mean, the French were our first allies, but we also have a lot of tension often between the two of us, and Bordeaux wine reflects that. And
and it still does. I mean, I read sometimes the news like, let's just slap an extra tax on the wine that come from Europe or this region, and it can change the politics of things because it's such a big economy. I mean, if you do that, it could be locally perceived as an offense. Again, you're talking about very passionate population there, and that could affect export, import, and all of that at a high level. Because here's a question for you. So you cover the character that made the story in this case, like the chef, the person that makes the wine, the producer. How do you see this reflecting onto the consumer? So not everybody can go to eat at the 3-5 star Michelin restaurant. Not everybody can buy the bottle of wine that costs hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And you have to say, well, good thing that is open to maybe a $10 bottle of wine. Not everybody can afford that. And
no, I totally agree. Now, I mean, the 3-star Michelin restaurants have become, I really don't go that often because they have become so expensive that it just doesn't fit well with me. But I think, and same thing with the most expensive wines. I really appreciate them, but I don't drink them regularly. I've had one bottle from that book left of Chateau Ozone, which must be $400 or something outrageous. And I haven't been able to find a time where I'm really willing to open that.
And I hope you kept it well.
Yeah, I hope so too. It's sitting in my cellar. I think it's 1998. So from the year I did, and I don't know when to use it because it's I have one bottle, but it's so expensive. But I think you're right. These the prices and of the top most exclusive stuff have become unaffordable to most people, and forbidding. Even if you could afford it, you're not sure you really want to spend that much money on it. So,
but does it drive the decision, let's say, the trends of regular people kind of restaurants and wine? So are they still leading?
Like
it's kind of like, I'm thinking fashion, right? I mean, not many people can afford the griff, but if they say Gucci said this and Armani said that, and everybody follows.
I think it's haute cuisine, and you have pret-à-porter. Even when I was doing it, and I made that analogy, I remember with Bernard Loiseau, the chef I profiled, that we went to a series. He created a series of bistros, and he was always thinking about how could he make his haute couture product more accessible, because the money's in pret-à-porter more than haute couture. They don't make that much money. He was struggling financially until he was able to leverage his name and his notoriety to these other ventures. And wine is a lot the same way. It's there's one Chateau Ozone that's getting $400 a bottle or something, but the guys really making the money, and there's been consolidation in the wine industry, are able to produce the $10 to $20 bottle that can sell in larger quantities, often using some of the same techniques, but on less prestigious vineyards. Or I was always searching out for myself, and Bordeaux is a large wine region makes a lot of ordinary everyday wines, and there are guys who are making in these less prestigious places in Bordeaux some well-priced wines. So,
and let's face it, not everybody can tell the difference.
No, and it can be well made. If it's well made, it's well made, right?
I mean, it takes a sommelier probably to say, no, this is the $400.
Yeah,
this is
I'd always. It's interesting. A lot of the great value wines now come from Spain, and I'd written a story about Spanish wine and had an idea. I could never sell the book, but as Spain has modernized, so has its winemaking. And there was one family, the Palacio family, who I really thought was interesting because they were a Rioja family, and then they were kicked out of the son was kicked out because he had gone to Bordeaux and studied with Michel Rolland and the other famous modern winemakers, and had been kicked out of the family vinery and went to an unknown place called Priorat in Spain, a very rugged region south of Barcelona. And he started producing wines, and Robert Parker and others saw them, and they became the best wines highly rated wines out of Spain. His family vineyard went broke, and they followed him in, and he revived it. Now he makes wine all over Spain and in places that used to make unknown wines, like Berceau, if you've ever heard of it. I just bought some Palacios de Berceau. It makes from a grape that no one rated called Mencia. It's not It's not that far from Pinot Noir in some ways.
Okay.
It's a little less robust than traditional Spanish wines, but you find great Spanish wines all over the country, great ones in southern Italy. So, I mean, these techniques are being exported. And I know there's a lot of nostalgia for sort of the tradition and terroir. And there was even a movie made with some of the same characters I portrayed in my book called Mondovino, which was lamenting how...
I heard of it. I never was seen of it.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite of my book. He basically thought that Michel Rolland and all these Robert Parker were ruining French wine, standardizing tastes, and bringing an American lack of culture to the French wine world. And it's a point of view. It wasn't my point of view, though.
But you know what? To finish this conversation, we're already at 40 minutes, and I could talk about this forever. And anytime you want to come back and chill with me and tell more story, I'm happy to have you. But
after this, I wrote a book about golf, of all things. We can have that.
I gave it a few try when I was living in Florida, so we can talk about golf too. Yep. But in this case, I want to close with this. Every story, if you use the standard storytelling, there's always the antagonist. There's the good, there's the bad, there is the one that think one way, the one that think another, and in these all stories that you told, either the cuisine or the other book, the other movie, even in describing how there are the traditionalists, the one that want to open to different markets and culture, those are what makes story. If there was one way only, it would be pretty boring. We would never evolve, right? So the way I see it, the lesson is it's okay that some people likes and see the world that way and others see the other, as long as from that we grow, right? And I think that's a lesson for a lot of things, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in all these stories, it was modern versus tradition, and of course both have their values and both have their pleasures. There's not one mono taste, and what makes France so appealing still is how it manages to bring the modern and traditional together. Spain is great too. I think that in Europe is still a real story. And if the idea is we're going to go back to 1900 or Europe will just become a museum, that's really would be sad in the end. In winemaking and in food, they're still innovators in many other fields. Often the French just don't realize or accept that, hey, they got Europe's most valuable company and it makes Louis Vuitton's handbags, but that's something pretty good, right? And they've created something pretty modern from that.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the lesson that we're looking now into a lot of industry. There is this coming back to a tradition, but with the technology that we have. So I love the fact that we're kind of merging both. I mean, even in the car industry, if you want to look at that right now, they're bringing back an old style, old model, but with the modern technology. So it's kind of interesting. Bill, I really, really appreciated your conversation, your stories, and again, sure, come back with the golf.
I'll be in Los Angeles in mid-November. We should get together and do the golf thing with my son, who's the golfer. Okay, and
that will be great. Bring him in. Bring him on.
Yeah, I'll bring him in. He's in Long Beach, so we get together with him.
Sounds good. Okay? All right, everybody, stay tuned. We'll be linked to the books from Bill and the story and his social media if you want to get in touch with him. And of course, stay tuned. We'll have more story, maybe about food, about other things, and enjoyable, I hope, for everybody. Subscribe, stay tuned. See ya, Bill. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals with Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our shows. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.